Hello there, I'm Virtuoso, and welcome to my complete guide to Trials. Trials is Eterspire's multiplayer co-op mode and is currently the main way for players to obtain some of the best in slot gear in the game. This video will cover everything you need to know about Trials, including an overview of what they are and the rewards for completing them. This will be followed with recommended builds for each class and recommended party compositions, and finally specific mechanics to keep in mind for particularly challenging Trials. Trials take place in an instanced area in which players will first face against multiple waves of mobs. After all mob waves are defeated, a boss will spawn for the players to take on together. Unlike in general play, in which each player will have their own instance of mobs and bosses, the ones encountered in Trials are shared across the entire party. Because of this, mobs and bosses in Trials will have significantly more health compared to ones encountered normally. There's no such thing as a free lunch, so be sure to do your part when running Trials. This will also lead to some interactions that will be important to know about when we cover specific mechanics later in this guide. Upon defeating the boss, each player will be granted a random reward, which will at least consist of a shard or rune of the Trial's corresponding level range, or sometimes a soul fragment. Additionally, bosses may rarely drop a gear of normal or excellent quality, along with potential cosmetics such as capes and familiars. Completing endgame Trials is how players currently obtain some of the best in slot gear in the game. Having an effective build is crucial for you to consistently complete Trials, especially considering the unique roles each class has in group content. Guardian serves as the main tank class of Eterspire, with a variety of damage reduction abilities, and is the only class currently in the game that can actively control how mobs and bosses behave. Warrior is the generalist utility class that provides both offensive and defensive buffs to the entire party and can also serve as an effective off-tank should the need arise. Rogue is a specialist damage dealer class that provides sustained single target damage, as well as an attack speed boost to the entire party, which serves both offensive and defensive purposes due to its synergy with lifesteal. Finally, Sorcerer is a specialist damage dealer class that instead focuses on area of effect burst damage. Each class also has a meta weapon due to the utility they provide for group content. These are Bardish for Guardian, which provides party-wide damage reduction, Halberd for Warrior, which provides a party-wide damage boost, Short Sword for Rogue, which provides a party-wide attack speed boost, and Thunderstaff for Sorcerer, which provides wide circular area of effect burst damage. On the screen now, you'll find my recommended builds for each class. I will include a specific timestamp for this part of video in the video description so that you can revisit this part as much as you need. While most of the builds here should be self-explanatory, I want to point out some important things to consider for each class. To start, while I generally recommend tank classes to take Vitality and damage classes to take Strength, you're more than welcome to mix and match to your personal preference. For example, if you're having difficulty consistently surviving Trials as a damage dealer, feel free to spec into Vitality to increase your survivability. On the other hand, once properly geared as a tank, you can consider investing in Strength to maximize your damage output. Specifically for warriors, your party members may request you take Shout or Battlecry depending on whether the party can benefit more from damage reduction or more damage boost beyond your Halberd buff, so be prepared to switch builds as needed. While rogues primarily excel at sustained single target damage, they may sometimes benefit from taking another area of effect damage ability such as Blade Dance when the party needs more area of effect damage for wave clear, or for when Trials in which multiple bosses spawn at the same time. Finally, for sorcerers, the current iteration of endgame Trials prioritizes melee range combat due to the way mobs spawn in Trials and how Arcane Tempest needs to be cast close to your foes to maximize its damage output. This elevates both Frost Nova and Blizzard above Electric Orb and Meteor for current endgame Trials. For free-to-play players, you will need to commit to one build due to the lack of ability resets, though you can consider leveling up multiple characters with different builds if you're willing to do so. What you need next to succeed in Trials is to understand proper party compositions. Before participating in Trials, you must be in a party. To quickly recap on how to start a party, simply click on a player or their name in the chat channel and select Invite to Party. You can also accept invitations from others. For those who want to try their hand at soloing Trials, you can start a party yourself without inviting anyone simply by selecting Create Party in the Party page under Social Options. As we previously covered, each class in Eterspire serves different purposes in Trials. It's important to note here that all classes have their respective strengths and weaknesses, which will make them stand out at different stages of trial progression. For example, while it may seem that sorcerers are simply superior to rogues when properly geared in their current iteration of endgame Trials, that mainly applies to the scenario in which all characters are equipped with the best in slot endgame gear. When it comes to progressing through trials prior to obtaining best in slot endgame gear, rogues will generally have the edge over sorcerers due to their ability to provide both sustained damage and utility for the entire party. When progressing through trials prior to obtaining best in slot gear, it's recommended to have a party of 4 players with a balanced team composition. Here are some examples of team compositions you can consider when creating a party for trials. One notable exception for parties in the current iteration of Trials is the 1 Warrior 3 Sorcerer team comp once best in slot gear have been obtained. This is due to the high damage scaling sorcerers have on Arcane Tempest in comparison to the health pool bosses currently have. A warrior can then further amplify this through party-wide damage boosts. This allows a fully geared party to obliterate both mobs and bosses within literal seconds. However, do keep in mind that you will need best in slot gear to be able to consistently pull this off, and future trials may account for this disparity in burst damage between sorcerers and other classes. Now that you have a full understanding of how trials work along with recommended builds and party compositions, we will move on to specific mechanics to keep in mind for some of the more difficult trials in the game. To start, most of the trials you encounter when leveling are quite easy to complete with a full party of players with the appropriate levels and gear, with bosses sharing the same status effects used as their solo boss counterparts. Most of those trials also share the same loot table as their solo boss counterparts, meaning that you will outlevel the gear you obtain from them fairly quickly. Therefore, this section will focus on the endgame trials, which currently consist of the Trials of the Mountain located in Vestadian range. The first thing to know prior to entering any trial is to be aware of what status effect bosses from each trial use. You will want to have at least 2 players utilizing tier 4 or tier 5 amulets that provides temporary immunity to the specific status effect the bosses use. This is important to ensure 100% uptime of the immunity. It's also important to communicate with party members which players will use the amulet first, so players in the party can stagger out their amulet abilities to ensure 100% uptime. Here's a list of all the bosses from all Trials of the Mountain and what status effects they use in combat. Next up, while mobs are generally not nearly as threatening compared to bosses, make sure to properly position yourself to effectively clear mobs with your party. This is currently done by stacking yourself with your party members at the center of the map, as the mobs will spawn in a circle around you before closing in. It's important to keep track of which waves you're on to ensure you're ready prior to the boss spawn. And here's a list of how many waves of mobs there are prior to the boss spawn in each Trial of the Mountain. As a note for Guardians, do keep in mind that it's often expected for you to take most of the damage from mobs by using Taunt, due to your higher health pool and damage reduction abilities. Once the boss spawns, a mechanic you will need to keep track of is aggro. In group content, aggro simply refers to which player the boss is currently attacking. In the current iteration of group content, bosses have what's called proximity-based aggro, which means that they prioritize attacking the player closest to them, regardless of how much damage each player does. After attacking the player 2 to 3 times, bosses will then switch to the player closest to the one they were previously attacking. This cycle will then repeat itself until either the bosses or the players are defeated. There are a few important points to consider with this in mind. First, because bosses will switch aggro between players closest to them, players with low health or are too undergeared to take damage from bosses can simply position themselves farther away from bosses to avoid being attacked entirely. This can be taken advantage of through good positioning, such as the case in this layout on the screen. Next, Guardians can use Taunt to force bosses to attack them, which can come in handy when a party member is low on health, or when particularly powerful damage reduction abilities are active, such as Divine Aegis. And finally, bosses will not switch targets until they have gotten their 2 to 3 attacks in, or until a Guardian uses Taunt. Therefore, it's not recommended for you to retreat when you're under attack until the bosses attacking you have switched to a different target, unless you want to be on the receiving end of a wild goose chase. For a much more in-depth and detailed breakdown on how aggro works in Eterspire, I will provide a link to a video on the topic by VeryOK, a longtime community moderator for the game, and an experienced Guardian player who originally taught me everything about aggro when Trials first came out earlier this year. In my previous video on gear progression, I mentioned that you want to obtain a set of Wintertide or more ideally Azurbrake gear. Having a set of good quality and well upgraded Azurbrake gear will allow you to comfortably clear the 1st through 4th Trials of the Mountain, known collectively as T1, T2, T3, and T4. Endgame weapons are currently obtained mainly from T4, However, if you do not mind weapon swapping, you can also consider purchasing an off-meta best-in-slot weapon from other players for significantly cheaper prices. Weapon swapping refers to a strategy players use in which they use a meta weapon of lower tier to cast a desired weapon ability, before switching to a higher tier off-meta weapon to do more damage while still benefiting from the meta weapon ability. The final and hidden trials of the mountain, also known as T5 and T6 respectively, are where you have a rare chance to obtain Everfrost gear, the best in slot gear currently in the game. However, the boss in T5 has much higher amount of health and does much more damage, and on top of that uses both blind and stun, so ensure that you have a balanced party of sufficiently geared players with amulets to resist both statuses prior to entering. Some players may skip T5 entirely due to the lower drop rate for Everfrost gear, instead opting for T6. Completing T6 will provide you with an increased drop rate for Everfrost gear, but T6 is much harder to clear than T5. This is because you will be facing off against both bosses from T4 and T5 at the same time. There's also an additional gear penalty applied to players who are not sufficiently geared, similar to facing against mobs and bosses that are of significantly higher levels than them. To remove this gear penalty, ensure that you have at least 4 pieces of Fatebringer or Everfrost armor equipped prior to entering T6. One practical tip specifically for T6 is to change the positioning of your party in the area. Instead of stacking in the middle of the area, stand on this one elongated piece of rock on the ground as indicated. While this positioning may not be as ideal for clearing mobs, it will force the 2 bosses to stack together when they spawn, allowing your party to effectively deal area of effect damage to both at the same time. And that covers everything you need to know about trials so far. With a new tier of gear and more trials on the roadmap for the remainder of 2025, I will keep an eye on them and provide more up-to-date information when they drop. In the meantime, make sure to check out my gear progression guide so that you can be properly geared for current and future trials. Until next time, this is Virtuoso signing out. Happy hunting.